I think it's interesting that in English, the pronoun I is capitalized, not the pronoun we or even you, but I. So
Heavy
the
man.
Anglo-Saxon cultures are extremely individualist.
Yeah.
And
Which starts with I, by the way.
and as represented even in the capitalization of the pronoun anywhere in the sentence, not just the beginning.
No, it's like a important word.
Now,
that also starts with an I.
Yeah, it's pretty clever.
I mean, there are lots of other languages
Important.
where we capitalize words for different reasons in different ways. In German, we're capitalizing lots of pronouns, not just the I pronoun. And it can occur anywhere in the sentence or in certain places in the sentence. But it's very interesting that in the most individualist cultures in the world, where individualism really developed to the standard that it is today, and I'm not demoting it. There is great value in individualism. There are great problems associated with it as well. When there's too much of it, it can become toxic, and I think we've talked about some of that.
Yes.
But in English, this high value on individualism is represented linguistically, even in the way that we write the pronoun I.
Okay, sure it is.
I agree.
Wow.
And who are you?
I don't know.
You're Torin.
Yes.
And you're Tom
yeah.
Peterson.
And you're Dean Foster.
And here we are talking about culture because, oops, your culture's showing.
You know, and hopefully you don't, because otherwise why listen to this? But just kind of going off of your little pronoun thing there with I being capitalized, the only other time we really, other than at the beginning of a sentence, the only time is we take another pronoun and we attribute it to a higher being, a god or something. Then we give it status to say that it should be capitalized. But yeah, and in the English language, the only one is I that gets capitalized every single time.
As a pronoun.
As a pronoun, but standing by itself.
I mean, there are lots of other nouns that do get capitalized.
Or in a contraction where it is
if you're mentioning a particular group of people or a particular culture, you're going to capitalize that.
But those aren't pronouns.
But they're not pronouns,
no.
right? And
they're proper nouns.
And of all the pronouns,
I becomes a proper noun because of the way it's capitalized.
And in opposition to the fact that we could choose to capitalize we, but we don't. We capitalize the single individual.
We or you.
Or even you.
I need to ask, we haven't announced that this is grammar time. Is this officially grammar time?
Hold on, let me check.
Okay.
Grammar time. Grammar time. Everybody loves grammar time.
But it's culture time.
Culture time.
Because grammar
Culture time. Everybody loves
culture time. All right.
because grammar is representative. Once again, it's just a manifestation of culture. And so the way we organize our linguistics and our speech is a window into our culture, which is why people work the way that they do or don't, and to the degree to which one would work in a certain way is going to be constrained and designed by the culture in which we're working.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think an article came out just recently also about how in France, for example, the lunch cannot be taken in the workplace. Is that correct?
At all.
Yeah, I saw this on NPR in the last month from when we were recording. We're recording this in July.
That would be National Public Radio.
To let you all know, yes, National Public Radio. So I believe in June 2022. Yeah, I saw that article too. I think it was from, we've mentioned the Rough Translation podcast, and I think it was associated with that as well, and they talk about global cultures. And right, it was that eating at your desk is banned in France.
Lunch.
For lunch, yeah, in the workplace.
Eating at the desk, though.
Yep.
Like there could be other areas in the workplace where you could eat.
But I think the idea is
they don't want you eating
solo
at the desk.
lunch eating is frowned upon.
Oh, the I,
and so
the individual by themselves is frowned upon.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because the premise is here in France, we value the input from others in the downtime that we have to share a meal together.
Right. Right. And I remember the article was talking about, I believe, if I remember correctly, I think I do, it started in the 1890s, where there were just a lot of, more and more diseases that folks were catching.
Infectious diseases.
Right. And so the idea was, okay, we have this time around lunch, and with the Industrial Revolution, now there's, the work day and there's lunchtime. So during lunchtime, let's get people out of the office, out of this cramped space, or factory, or wherever the workplace is, out of this cramped space into the open air. And then it sort of became part of the culture of, well, this is the expectation, where we go out to eat with other people in that social environment like you're talking about. Yeah.
Right. And I think that's very, very interesting, because from our vantage point today, we can look at this phenomenon and we can say, oh, look at the French tradition of gathering and socializing at lunch, and that they're valuing the need for people to socialize with each other and to be together with each other as something that can actually be beneficial to the workplace.
Yeah.
While that's probably true now, there was a component when this started that had to do with something far more basic, which was hygiene.
Right.
And we don't want people to spend their full 8 hours a day in a tuberculosis infested stew.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
Sure.
Exactly. But the fact that now it's become valued as a benefit to work and to business, that people should have downtime away from their desk, away from their screens, in order to socialize with each other. One could say that, well, we're romanticizing the origins of this tradition, which were very different from the way it's become. But on the other hand, it didn't become valued that way for no reason.
Right.
So there is something, in fact, in French culture which tends to value this, even today, beyond the fact that it helps you avoid tuberculosis.
Well, let me throw something in there that I think goes to the value. Is that, I mean, look at the French culture. It greatly values food and drink. So the idea that you diminish the food and drink and make it into a byproduct or a pastime, a quick pastime.
But it's just as something
necessary
as a bodily function. Just get the food in
from
there.
Passing out in the afternoon is just totally against the essence of that part of the French culture.
That does seem to be more of an appreciation of life and enjoying the food and drink that you have, as opposed to it's just functional. I need this to be able to be productive.
So there were lots of other cultural reasons for the French to value this, and therefore it should be no surprise that it evolved,
that it caught on
in France into the tradition it is now. Right.
I want to, from what you're talking about, it sounds like, because I did not hear it on NPR or read the article, but because as you can see, I prepared for this. But the idea of the desk, I think Dean used one word that I think is very important in today's society now, and especially coming off of the pandemic, where so much was done this way, the screen. But because the screen also, what has that done in France, in many places? Yeah. It doesn't necessarily mean that person is sitting there and, like there are places in America where that person's sitting there dragging their lunch in and sitting over the computer and eating while they're working and so on. But the reality is, in a lot of cases, they're not working. They're doing other things.
They're scrolling Facebook or whatever.
Yeah, whatever.
Whatever social media.
Yeah. And so that's what's going on there. And that is so much... to me, it seems like in the French culture, that's just you're not focusing on the food and the company or the drink. You're focusing on this.
Yeah,
well, I think
antisocial.
Antisocial.
Yeah,
and what we're, I think, fundamentally looking at and describing here is the difference between work to live cultures and live to work cultures.
Sure.
Yeah.
where work is seen either as something you do in order to get on with your life.
Yeah.
And as a society, we're going to create a system or groups of systems that allow one to live a certain way. And working toward that is one of the ways that we do that, as opposed to the opposite, which would be live to work.
Right.
Where work is seen as something that can give you an advantage above others. There's the individualist, above others, independent of creating a society where everyone can live a life based that is decent and functional and providing all the things that we need. So do we live in a culture that is dedicated toward or valuing nurturing a way of living as a society, or do we live in a culture where it's all about individual competition in order to create the kind of life you as an individual and your immediate family want to live?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you have all sorts of different kinds of behaviors that evolve out of this basic difference orientations, these two basic different orientations.
Sure.
So you'll have the American just shoving the food down their throat at their desk because biologically they need a certain amount of nutrition in order to continue the next 8 hours.
Yeah.
And then you have the French who are going to resist that kind of thing because they're looking to create a society where everyone can benefit from the fact that we work the way we work,
Right.
and that we work to live as opposed to live to work.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it is also a culture that is very proud of its past and where it comes from and its development. I mean, they have laws about certain use of words and language in France, protecting the French language. And so if you're feeling that way about your culture, it's something to say, no, we're not going to let you become this kind of bland version of what we've been. We're going to say to you, and if we have to do it through legislation, then we will, because that, in essence, that is kind of what government's supposed to do if you really want to go that direction.
Yeah.
And help you have an excuse to be able to say, well, I can't stay here for lunch. I have to go out. Good.
Right.
Then go out and do that, because then you're susceptible to the other parts of the culture that you know very well about the French food, cuisine, the wine, and so on and so forth, and all of those things. So it would seem to me that this just goes right with that.
Right. Well, I know that here in the U.S., I have worked past 5 o'clock in the afternoon many times, and I've been talking with a supervisor, a manager at that time, and especially when I was younger, I would do that more often. I've tried to do less and less of that as time goes on and try to kind of disconnect at the end of the workday. But there's no regulation, there's no law against, talking to a manager or continuing to work till 6 or 7, and it can be very tempting, especially in a live to work culture to kind of get immersed into that, right? So there was another article, again, through rough translation on NPR, that talked about in Portugal that there are laws that are referred to anyways, right to disconnect laws, where the manager or the boss will be actually fined, I think it's about 10,000 euros for getting in contact with the employee past 5 o'clock.
For contacting an employee after hours.
Right.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah,
Wow.
exactly.
Because this is not just this idea is not just confined to France. This is more of a pan-European idea where government and legislation is responsible for ensuring a certain quality of life for all the citizens.
Right.
Right. And that means disconnecting from the workplace or taking orders from the boss or the supervisor. And we'll see this throughout all of Europe in comparison to the extremely live to work attitude. And it is extreme, and it is in the U.S., where no matter what, the way you live your life is dependent on what you do as the individual and the degree to which you dedicate yourself or lean in to the success that you envision. And it is highly competitive and individualistically competitive.
Mm.
And the government doesn't owe you anything for the kind of quality of life that you're going to experience.
Yeah.
Right.
So you get this mythical idea that the more we work and the harder we work and the longer we work,
Mm-hmm.
the more we're going to get something back for that in
Right.
terms of the quality of life that we can create for ourselves and our families. And it's interesting now with the pandemic and with the development of technology, living on screens, that real time and anytime can get conflated.
Right.
Mhm.
Right. Sure.
And working from home because of the pandemic becomes something which is really gets translated in the US, in the individualist culture, in the work to live culture. I'm sorry, in the live to work culture.
Mhm.
It gets translated into 24/7 work.
Right. Exactly.
Mhm.
Right. Because you can.
Right.
You know, without the
So-
boundaries that have been set
Yeah, and
amongst
and
you as employees, it could happen.
and those who believe that are working themselves to death,
Right.
even more so than it's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
While the response to the pandemic and to technology and to all of this in the work to live cultures, and we'll go to the other side of the pond to see that, France and Germany and many of the European cultures,
Mhm.
it's not creating a 24/7 work culture. In fact, we're having legislation against that.
Right.
Such as what you're talking
To
about.
set up
Right.
the government
Precisely.
these
Right.
boundaries. Right.
Precisely.
Yeah, that I can see that very easily. I think it's yes in here because and the expectations in here on this side of the pond, it's the expectations become that you produce more.
So our reaction to technology and the pandemic is culturally determined.
Mm.
It should
Sure
be no
it is.
surprise that that this is now becoming a real issue in the U.S. and it's more
Right. It's
24/7
very much
work
our culture.
than it's ever been.
Mhm.
Right.
Even though it's always been that way, but now this stuff is being used to even promote that to a greater degree,
Right.
and creating a backlash.
Right.
Yes,
Right.
yes.
Well, the home
And-
has become the workplace for so many more people, and so there's this much
Yeah.
more of a blurring between work life, home life.
And this
Literally.
and this
and with
backlash,
very little training on how to handle it.
Right. Exactly. Kind of thrown into it.
and this backlash is coming mainly. It's because it's forming along generational lines, and it's forming along gender lines.
Hmm.
So women are particularly affected by this because they're also having to be the caretakers for children,
Sure.
for the most part.
Hmm.
So they're on the front lines of this development, and the younger generation, and I say that because I don't know if it's Gen X or Gen Y at this point. I'm such
Gen Z.
an old boomer. But certainly most of the worker generation younger than me, which
Yeah.
is most of the generation.
All the other generations.
All the other
yes.
generations. There's a backlash to this
Mhm.
because they're not signing up for this. They're saying,
Right.
I'm not signing up for this kind of a significant number are not. Those who have the choice not to, those who may be privileged enough not to, right?
I think that's an important point.
Mhm.
But
Sure.
it takes different kinds of forms so that people are questioning, I can't work 4 different jobs for minimum wage and still not be able to have enough at the end of the week to pay my bills.
Right.
That this is a rigged system
Mhm.
Mhm.
Yeah.
and that I'm not sure that this is going to benefit me.
Mhm.
So the belief, the implicit belief before that the culture was promoting is now being questioned by significant numbers of people.
Yep.
Now, those who benefit from it, they're not questioning it. Right.
Right.
But a whole lot of more people who aren't benefiting from it are questioning it.
Yeah.
Now, are there equal numbers questioning the system in Europe? Sure there are. But
Mhm.
in Europe, it's the other way around.
Mm.
It's the question there of giving people the individual access to control their lives so that they can achieve more should they be able, should they want to, and if they could, if they have the tools and the goods to. But in Europe, the society was always it becomes government's responsibility to create a system and a society where people can all live a decent life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I think there's been the dismantling of that on the other side of the pond in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, first of all, that has been mostly held up to us as being un-American, almost, in the sense that the support of the government has been looked at as being, the boogeyman word is socialism and supporting things. Well, during the pandemic, we had socialism in areas we haven't had socialism, at least not as much, in trying to just keep things moving, as opposed to letting them just suffer and that type of thing. Yep. But let me just jump back a little bit, just because I think you made some really good points about the younger generation and things like that. However, I will tell you this. I mean, I teach in a university, so I'm getting students typically who are somewhere in the range of 18 to 25 in that range. And I teach online, and I teach what is now known as asynchronous classes, because I find that I believe it is a much more intelligent approach to online teaching than synchronous, which means synchronous means you are basically setting up a classroom that you are doing in a given time, and you're looking at people's faces on a screen, and you're going through your classroom like that. Asynchronous means I'm going to provide you, typically, it means I'm going to provide you with information. I'm going to provide you with whatever becomes the lecture for that week. I'm going to provide you with assignments, and you have maybe a week. It depends on the thing, but you maybe have a week to accomplish this. When do you do that? Up to you. And so it kind of goes, when you talk about the legislation in Portugal, I think one of the problems with that is that it looks at things in a pre-online format. And I'm not saying I don't think it's a good thing, because I think there's a value to it, because you're coming from a world like that, and you're coming from an awful lot of people who are going to be the executives who are mainly from that world, and they're going to look at it with that mindset. But the younger generation is starting to look at it in a more all-encompassing mindset. Right. And so they are that stuff is going to have to adjust at some point and say, we can't just look at a 9 to 5 day or whatever it is.
And maybe they have, and I don't know the particulars of those laws, but you're right that they have to look at the changes in
and that's a struggle with any kind of movement forward in technology, especially. I mean, the joke always was to me, I didn't realize this when I was younger, and there was a thing called that I think, Dean, you and I both saw at the New York World's Fair, which, if you want to look that up online, we'll tell you how old we are.
The 1890s?
It was in the 1890s. And they had a thing called the Carousel of Progress. Carousel of Progress, sponsored by GE. And in it had all of these things that it took us from the days when things were just starting to come around, electricity was starting to be used.
All the benefits of industrialization.
It was moving us forward, and then it showed us the future. And it showed us the a
Jetsons type future.
Not even to the Jetsons, but it was sort of the woman in the, first of all, with very much a mindset out of the 50s. It showed us the future, and the woman at home, and how her life will be so easy because she will have the washer dryer, she will have this oven that can do this and that, and so on and so forth. I don't think it even foresaw like microwaves or anything like that. But it's all this. So her day will be filled with being able to read magazines and all the things that women like to do. No, not in our culture. In our culture, that meant, now you've got more time, get this done.
Well, I remember when the computer revolution began, and there was actual discussion about how this is going to free people from labor, and that we're going to have a whole class of people that are free of not having to do anything, and therefore, what does government's responsibility? Well, of course it didn't turn out that way because
get more productive.
Because that's the culture in which this developed.
That's right.
And therefore it became a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Because as you said, with all of with what the French are doing, what the Portuguese are doing, what many places are doing now, and in the United States, from the independent society and all of that, those things are the things that are going to reflect how these things manifest themselves.
Exactly.
They're not escaping from them. They are just altering given the new technology.
Now let's look at a curious twist on this. So you've got the work to live and live to work, and let's go the other way. Let's take a look at Japan. Now Japan is very much a live to work culture, because
Meaning that the work is their life.
if you became a salaryman in Japan, traditionally you were a slave to the organization,
Right.
and you worked 15 hours a day. I mean, and there were stories, replete of salarymen passing out on the subway in Tokyo, going home from a night of entertaining, which you were obligated to do, to be with your group,
Right.
and having
Except they couldn't fall over because the trains are very crowded.
and literally, and then waking up 3 hours later and going back to work again.
Right.
Now,
Yeah.
how
It's
does
like
this
working
happen
for a
in
law firm here in the United States.
How does this happen in a group-oriented culture like Japan?
Yeah.
Not individualist. But here we've got the phenomenon of the live to work in a group and consensus-oriented culture. So one of the reasons why this is happening there is because of your obligations to the group.
Okay.
Not your obligations to yourself and your family,
Right.
but the obligations to your group and your self-definition as a human being being defined by others,
Yeah.
not by yourself.
But not taking really, in that what you just described, does not take into consideration the family in that situation.
No, in fact, the family is secondary.
Yeah.
Right.
Interesting.
Because you're not going to be
You're
around
not
your
there.
family
You're
very
not
much
there.
if you're
Now,
on that schedule.
Now, there's backlash to that now in Japan. And
okay.
and also with the rise of China over the last 20 years, the dramatic and revolutionary rise in China, where everybody now is fundamentally, it's Wild West capitalism. So you're working for a company and you're looking to manifest that in a better life for yourself and your family. And right now there's backlash and questioning as to whether this is a rigged system and it's not going to work for me. Not that it's communist. I mean, it's communist politically, but not economically.
Right.
But it's the same
Not at all,
complaint that they're having that we're having here.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't really matter. It's still a capitalist system in both cases.
Sure.
You can look at how different cultures react to this live to work or work to live issue, and how it manifests itself in the workplace, and how we can make some predictions as to how it might go. But I think the safest prediction to make is to look at the culture in which this stuff is happening.
Yeah.
And you'll know the way it'll come out on the other side if you realize, are we in a culture like a live to work culture or a work to live culture? So no surprise that it's happening the way it's happening in the US.
Right.
And no surprise that it's happening the way it's happening in Germany.
Yeah.
Right.
Or I say Germany because I'm thinking of Germany. Let's say expand that to more Europe, pan-European. But I was thinking in terms of in Germany, one of the classic issues, you get the American going over to Germany. They're relocated. They're an expat. They work and they absorb their job. They say this is a great opportunity, and so they're working 15 hours a day. To show what you really have to do to make a success.
Right.
And the Germans like, maybe they'll say something to Joe over here about this, but they're talking with each other and they're saying, "What's the matter with this American? Like, they're working so many hours, and they lose respect for them because from the German cultural mindset, if you have to work 15 hours a day to get your job done,
Yeah.
then
You're doing
something's
something
wrong.
Right. You're doing something wrong.
You're disorganized. You're not smart enough. You haven't figured it out. You haven't planned it. You haven't coordinated. You haven't done whatever you need to do in order to do your job within the time based on human capacity.
Yeah.
Right.
You're
Yeah.
not very efficient.
And it's in the whole aspects. I see it in other areas too. For instance, I tend, when I'm teaching on the ground and in the classroom, I tend to teach long classes, like 3-hour classes. So when I'm with my students, I say, I'm going to give you breaks. And because the studies have been done that very clearly show that you can't sustain yourself at a high level for more than about an hour.
Yeah.
And that's kind of pushing it, but about an hour. So you got to get, even if it's
well,
5
depending on
minutes,
your age and your bladder, it could be
maybe
shorter
much
than
less.
that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, but if you are,
In
even
fact,
if you get,
I have to.
Okay.
crying out loud.
I'll be back in a
I know I
second.
told you to do that before we started. If they get a 5-minute break is plenty, except I will actually say to my students, look, no one gets to sit in this room. You can stand up in this room. You don't have to necessarily leave the room, but you got to stand up because, again, the studies have been done about that. And yet, if I had 20 kids in the classroom or 20 people in the classroom, and I say that on a regular basis, maybe 12 of those people will actually stand up.
Right.
And I try a couple times, and after that, I figure, well, what the heck? I'm not their dad. I'm not trying to fix everything about them. And part of it is the technology. They'll sit on their phone for that period of time. Now, I can ban the phone, but that's not the point. I actually want their mind to go someplace else for a while. Right. Because that freshens them up for them to receive what we're about to do again, and so on. And it makes sense. And but in the U.S.
And you're interacting with other people, potentially.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
I mean, we don't know how to relax and have a good time even, and so we stretch the whole thing out and we won't listen to that.
Well, doesn't it go back to the whole idea that, you fill the time that you have. And if you have 24 hours in which to work, you're going to fill it with some sort of work.
Some sort of.
But
it may
how
not be productive
is it?
Right. Exactly.
Right. And I think it's curious in the U.S. Because of the subcultures that exist in the U.S., you have this sometimes, I think, confusing message that's going on where if you work in this workplace, you can play ping pong, you can do, you can take a nap,
Silicon
you can
Valley.
go,
Absolutely.
the very kind of laid back kind of California thing.
Yeah, right.
But the point is, you better lean in 24/7, and
you're gonna be on.
And that ping pong game's got to be a little bit short, and you really got to produce according to the metrics at the end of every day, at the end of every week, at the end of every month.
Yep.
And so it's not as obvious. It's not, and I'll take the other extreme, which would be Manhattan, where we're not making believe we're having a good time. We're not having a good time. We're here to produce.
Right, we're doing the work. Yeah.
Right.
Here we go.
So, and that's
which
all
is
we're
probably
doing.
counterproductive, but nonetheless true.
Well, both are terribly counterproductive if you don't have human sustenance support.
Yeah. It's very much. And that's a really good point too, because I'm realizing watching these students, the way they behave, there is no support system that teaches them how to do this. There's anything that I introduce to them is almost inevitably brand new to them and therefore questioned.
Well, I think that goes to the individualism, because somebody once said that if you're in a meeting in the U.S., you have to say something, even if you have nothing to say, because if you don't say something, everyone's going to question, where's the value?
What are you doing?
Why is Dean here at the meeting? He didn't say anything. He didn't offer a solution.
Right.
He didn't come up with something that would have helped us all.
And there's meetings all the time.
Yeah. So if you don't say anything, you got to come up with something. Now, it doesn't have to be productive. It could be actually destructive. But
Sometimes I think,
but it looks like you're an important person. You have something to say.
Yeah.
I could disagree with it, and maybe we all disagree with it, but at least you said something.
Yeah.
And I've had people from cultures where if you don't have anything constructive to say, you stay quiet. And they've come to U.S. meetings and they say, wow, this is a battlefield. And and it's so unnecessary, all of this back and forth with people just saying things just to make it look like they had something to contribute. But now these variations, though, these differences are also on variational lines. So we said there's a difference between the way it manifests itself in California and the way it manifests itself in, let's say, Manhattan. There's a difference in Europe too. As you go further south in Europe, it becomes much more of this this kind of, well, traditionally it was this kind of work to live. And as you went north, where industrialization began, then it was more the opposite. Now it's kind of smoothed itself out, but there's lots of variations on this theme. But in the big picture, it's more this way on one side of the pond than it is that way on the other.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And you do have the scenarios very much of the global culture of working for a company that is based out of Europe, let's say,
right,
and working for them in the United States, and again, when companies from France, companies from Germany are going to have a different overall culture of their company, affecting the people in the United States who are working, and people from the United States are walking into that, and there's going to be an impact of that on them, and yet they're coming to it in the United States with that individual United States view of what I'm supposed to do, and first one in, last one out type stuff that isn't necessarily effective at all, but nonetheless is something that has been promoted a lot throughout this country for generations. And you bring that into a culture that is looking at, no, we want to look at you accomplishing this, or if it's a French culture that the company is from, is it the journey to where you're going as opposed to the final spot, the where you're land? All of those are different things in culture that have been there for decades, for centuries, and in some form, and that they're being crossed over. And this is the whole thing. And with the internet, you're dealing with this stuff perhaps on a continuous 24/7 type of scenario in some way.
I think that one of the things we have to be careful about is to assume that because we have this technology, that these differences are going to fade away and be sanded down.
Right.
And the truth is that there is absolutely no evidence in cultural interaction that differences get sanded down simply by virtue of being in proximity with one another. If anything, technology brings us in proximity with each other dramatically, instantly. But if anything, historically, when cultures come in proximity with each other, the first reactions, it's not about becoming more like the other or learning from the other or kumbaya or any of that. The first reactions is hostility, misunderstanding, confrontation,
your way,
defensiveness.
Yep.
And so I think we're really in a kind of tricky, if not dangerous moment, because until you learn the value of doing things the other way or the way someone else is doing it in their culture, until you learn the value of that, the immediate reaction often is all of that negative stuff.
Right.
I'm not going to do that. Why are you doing that? You don't understand me. I don't understand you. There's no value in that. There's no benefit. Blah, 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 blah.
Right. We've done it this way for a long time.
Right.
Whatever.
That's the immediate reaction. And right now, I think we're living in a moment where all of this intercultural contact is creating these first reactions. Now, can we get to that place where we can begin to see the value of doing it a different way? Sure we can.
Right.
But that's going to take
We have to manage that.
Education. It's going to take awareness. It's going to take helping people see the value of changing their ways. And if you've ever tried to get people to change their ways, you know how hard that can be.
Coming out of the pandemic, I get the sense that more Americans are open to, sort of practices and customs in work to live cultures, right? And saying, actually, that seems like a better fit given
That's definitely millennial. It's definitely Gen X. It's definitely Gen Y.
And so
absolutely.
I have a question because I've seen over the last couple of years just more and more articles about the idea of a 4-day work week or in pilot programs in the U.S. around that. Are there countries that have? Do you know if there are countries that have a 4-day work week?
It's not just a 4-day work week, I think, and there are some. Yes, there
Okay.
are. And in fact, the EU is moving toward instituting, I think, a 4.5-day
Okay.
work week as
Okay.
a standard.
Interesting.
I'm not sure about the details of that,
Mhm.
but I've seen that movement materializing.
Okay.
But it's also ideas like a guaranteed income,
Mm. Yeah.
right? Because we because we may be developing through technology an entire class of people that cannot work, and not because they can't work, but because there's no need for it.
Right.
So, do we need to evolve into a guaranteed income for everyone?
Right.
Is that a solution?
Right.
As opposed to having people living on the streets,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Yeah, there are lots of those kinds of things, and I think it's very active, and I think there's a lot of momentum in these directions.
Right.
As radical as they may sound, only to the ears of the within the U.S. culture, these things sound radical,
Yeah.
right? But what's
They're sounding less radical.
What's
Yeah, but-
radical? What is radical about
No.
providing basic human needs
Right.
for to the society?
No, that's
Because you're
good.
not
Right.
pulling yourself up by your
Well,
own bootstraps.
exactly.
Well,
Culture.
because
And
there you
therefore,
go.
you're creating a spoiled generation or whatever you
Culture
want.
and political will.
We've
Yep.
heard these things many, many times in
Yep.
this country, and I will say that I think that there is no chance, regardless how well we do, that you or I will live to see that happen in this country.
Well, and that's to your question. What's going to manifest? How long will it take? Will it ever?
I think
take,
it's a slow
We'll see.
process
We'll see.
in this country.
Yeah.
Only
It's not gonna be
because
overnight.
people have been conditioned, and this is part of culture.
Yep.
People have been conditioned to fear it
Mm-hmm.
for reasons that are against
Because
their
it's
own
radical.
betterment.
Seen as radical.
Yes.
Yep.
Because they benefit a small group of people who can basically make money.
It will have a lot of
Off
have a
of
big
that.
platform and lots of money to say this
That's
is
where the
not
benefit
good.
goes.
This
Yes.
is radical. This is scary.
And that's why it takes major difficulties usually
Right,
to get some sort of evolutionary
disrupt that.
significant movement as opposed to the much slower evolution
Well,
process.
That also raises the other cultural issue, and we can probably have another podcast about this,
I think we're going to have to.
which is evolutionary cultures and revolutionary cultures. That there are some cultures that make great progress very, very slowly.
Yeah.
There are some cultures that make slow progress, or not so much progress, very, very quickly.
Very quickly.
Right.
Now, at the end of
We're
the
going
day,
to work on that, as we
One
often do.
podcast at a time.
As we often do.
Mhm.
Yes.
Because-
Yes. Oops. Your culture's showing. Smell you.
Okay, listen, the way to get hold of us is oopscultureshow@gmail.com. And our Twitter handle is oopscultureshow. Whether this is the first episode or the third episode or whatever episode that you've listened to, you should really subscribe. That's the best way to go, really, honestly. I know what I'm talking about. All right, so just subscribe through iTunes or through wherever you get your podcasts from. Subscribe. Thank you.